Hello, everyone, and welcome to this lecture in the SSR Ideas series of lectures on COVID-19 and the impact on the economy. Today, we're absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Jose Antonio Ocampo, who may be familiar to many viewers of this because of all the work that he has done on international financial architecture, on debt, and on a whole range of other issues on liquidity, on SDRs globally. Professor Ocampo has had many distinguished positions. I'm not even going to try and list all of them, but among a lot of relevant ones, he has been a minister in Colombia, finance minister and minister of agriculture, and in charge of planning. He has been the Undersecretary General at the United Nations. He's currently at Columbia University, where he's the co-director of the IPT, and he's involved in a range of international commissions of great relevance and importance. I know because I've been privileged to work with him in two of them, where it's an absolute pleasure because of the tremendous passion and intensity that he brings to all this work. So thank you so much, Jose Antonio, for joining us today. And we're going to have a lecture today on basically the multilateral institutions approach to Latin America, which is extremely topical, exactly something that is exercising many of our minds. And so we're all looking forward to this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Yayati. I'm delighted to be with you on the other side of the world today to talk about this issue. As well, let me say I will start actually with my analysis of the Latin American economy and how it has been affected by the COVID-19 crisis. So let me, I will use, probably not throughout the lecture, but most of the time, a PowerPoint presentation which has essentially graphs. So, what is important in the case of Latin America is that this crisis hit us after a period of significant economic weaknesses. Latin America has actually been the region of the world, or the developing world, with the slowest economic growth for the past 3 decades. I'll show that graphically in a few minutes. And the last 5 years have been also particularly bad. This started essentially with the end of the commodity boom, of the super cycle of commodity prices, because of the high dependence of Latin America, and particularly of South America, on commodities. So when the boom of commodity prices came to an end in 2014, we started a period of slow growth. Now, that period of slow growth actually has also mixed with a lot of political problems of different character. The worst, of course, is Venezuela, which is, you can say, is one of the collapsing economies. It's one of the worst cases in history in terms of the collapse of economic activity. You can say the GDP today is about 1/3 of what it used to be, 5-6 years ago. You'll see that the numbers are not very good. But also we have a political crisis in Brazil, political transitions in Argentina and Mexico. And we have also a lot of demonstrations against the mainstream political system, starting, remember, with Chile, but also Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia. So all the major economies of Latin America have been hit also by some political events, let's say, of a significant character. This, I guess, is not unfamiliar to India, I guess, and to other parts of Asia. So let me actually start by showing you this in some numbers. Excuse me. So you see here the bars. This is the growth of GDP of Latin America since 1950. It doesn't have the projection for this year, which I will return later on. But it shows the periods of slow weaknesses, the 5-year periods, what I call the lost half decades. you see the three periods, the one that coincides with the Latin American debt crisis, then the second one, which is the result of the East Asian crisis, and the recent one. You can see actually the recent one, the last 5 years, have been the worst. The growth has been only 0.2% per year during the quinquennium, which is actually the worst, as you see in the post-war period. So Latin America was hit with this, with significant problems in all the economies. I mean, to start by size of the economies, Brazil had the worst recession in 2015, 2016, and has been recovering very slowly from that recession. Mexico actually entered into a stagnation and actually a bit of a small recession last year, which I think has some elements associated with political transition. Argentina, of course, is in a significant debt mess, which is unsolved. It's actually being on the table in recent days, because the Argentina's offer to the creditors was rejected by them a week ago, and they have been negotiating. Apparently, there's going to be new offers over the weekend. Chile, for example, which is also was one of the most dynamic economies of Latin America, was hit by the political events, etc., etc. So there's a significant effect that is built into that very poor performance. Now, but on top of a longer-term perspective, this is my point, that Latin America has been in a slow growth trajectory for the past 3 decades, and has the worst performance in the developing world. You see in the bottom the growth rates. In blue, you see the growth rate between 1950 and 1980 during this industrialization era of Latin America, and then after the debt crisis, 1990 2019. And you can see here in the bottom, Latin America used to grow during the industrialization era at 5.5% per year. The rate of growth in the last 3 decades is 2.7, so it's half what it used to be. And you can see here that most Latin American countries have grown less than what they did during the industrialization era. There are a few exceptions. I will not get into them. Perhaps if you want in the question and answers, we can go into this. As you see here, actually the productivity gaps of Latin America versus the US or Europe or wherever you want to estimate were, narrowing down very slowly, let's say, but they were narrowing down during the industrialization era between 1950 and 1980, but they're having a clear downward trajectory. You see the shock of the Latin American debt crisis, but then after the Latin American debt crisis, the trend is actually negative, with of course cycles associated basically to the commodity prices. You see in particular the commodity boom, 2002, 2014, and then the last 5 years, which I said were bad also in terms of economic growth. And one of the major reasons in the view of many of us is that the industrialization of Latin America, which has been quite severe. So in this graph, I put together 3 series of GDP, which show the share of manufacturing in GDP. Of course, due to the estimates and the different methodologies, they don't quite coincide. So that's why I have to excess here. But what is clear here is that there was a huge industrialization drive between 1950. It had actually started before, but between 1950 and the mid-1970s. And then you see a downward cycle, which took place during the debt crisis, but also has been actually quite severe after 1990. So Latin America essentially has deindustrialized on a massive scale. In relative terms, you can see here that we are essentially back to the mid-20th century, more or less, on a rough comparison. And one of the elements, and I will end that with this, my background presentation, has been the very significant gap in terms of technological development. Of course, you can say that Latin America did not do enough during the industrialization era to build the technological capacity, okay? I mean, what we have seen in some of the Asian economies, notably here in the Republic of Korea on the left, which is actually with Israel, the two leaders in terms of research and development spending. Is one case, but let's say in recent decades, China has also been an important case. Now you can see that Latin America on average invests only about 0.7% of GDP in science and technology versus a record for OECD of 2.3. The only Latin American country that invests more than 1% of GDP is Brazil. Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, and the rest actually invest very little. So this, of course, is also related to productivity, the idea that somehow the liberalization of the economy and the opening up to international trade was going to improve productivity and generate a wave of innovations, let's say, that has not materialized. Okay, let me actually stop here for a second. And no, actually, sorry, let me actually go back to now. Actually, one interesting issue is, of course, what are the shocks that Latin America has received because of the COVID-19 crisis. So here I have a long list of shocks, negative shocks. The first one is, of course, the worst world recessions in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Is minus 4.2 in world GDP according to the IMF. I always use not the number that the IMF talks about, which is minus 3%, because that's in purchasing power parity terms, which I guess coming from the United Nations is a wrong way of estimating world GDP. At market prices, at market exchange rates, is minus 4.2, what the IMF estimated. Then we have the collapse of international trade, which according to WTO would be at least minus 13%. The IMF estimates a bit less than that, minus 11%. But the WTO has also made a worse event scenario, which is minus 32%. And I think the main effect of the crisis is what I put out, a dark future for value chains. This, of course, is very important for Mexico, a few other economies of Latin America, which are inserted into value chains. Not for all countries. It's probably worse for East Asia, for example, which is the main center of value chains. Then you have the collapse of some services, which have affected some Latin American and Caribbean countries very hard, which is particular for the fall of tourism, or more than for the collapse of tourism. And of course, air travel, which is a worldwide phenomenon. The commodity prices have also fallen, but the pattern is quite different. The worst by far is the energy prices, and particularly the oil prices. So the oil-dependent economies of Latin America are hardly hit. This means Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and to some extent Bolivia and Peru. Not quite Mexico, because Mexico, though is an oil exporter, is a gasoline importer. So it's unclear whether Mexico is negatively affected by the fall of oil prices. Then you have the base metals and agricultural goods that are industrial inputs. Those have also fallen, not as much as energy prices, but they have fallen. And then there is a lot of effects. Well, there is mixed effects on other commodities. For example, coffee actually has increased in prices in recent months. But other goods, for example, cereals, have fallen a bit. So the agriculture actually, except for the agricultural inputs, for example, cotton, has not been as strongly affected as, let's say, the mineral and oil and minerals, which have been very hardly hit by the COVID-19 crisis. Then we have the negative trend in intra-regional trade, which is important because of the role of manufacturers in intra-regional trade. This, of course, is a trend that had been taking place in the last few years and will be made significantly worse by the crisis because of the closing of the borders that has taken place. And of course, the recessions that we'll see are hard. Then we have the massive capital flight from emerging economies that took place, I would say, in late February and particularly March. But we will see some good news since the mid-April, so that the collapse of portfolio capital flows was the worst in history, much worse than during the 2008-2009 crisis economies. But there are signs that the things are improving a bit. And finally, very importantly, the reduction in remittances. Latin America has a lot of migrants, particularly in the United States and Spain. And there's clear sign that the falling remittances is falling dramatically. But there's also intra-regional migration. For example, the loss of migrants from Peru to Chile, lots of migrants of Venezuela to many countries in the region, and actually they have lost their jobs. There is, for example, Colombia, which is the main recipient of Venezuelan migrants, have been seeing an outflow of migrants again. So people are returning. I mean, very much as Yayati, as you said, many workers in India going to their homes in the rural side. This is the same for Venezuela. They lost their jobs and they're going back to it. They lost their jobs in Peru, in Ecuador, in Colombia, and they're going back to Venezuela with their families. Now, due to this, and of course to the lockdowns are clearly excuse me, before that, I think this is a very important point, that international trade was actually not very dynamic before the crisis. You can see here that this is the monthly numbers that are estimated for the European Union by this Netherlands Bureau, which was the oil planning office of the Netherlands. What you see here, first of all, is the collapse that took place during the 2008-2009 crisis, but a strong recovery. We are not going to see that strong recovery this time. The collapse is going to be worse, probably, but the recovery is not going to be this, because particularly of the destruction of value chains and many similar phenomena. Now, you can see here, in any case, that the growth of trade in volume terms after the 2008-2009 crisis was very slow. With this number, you get something like a 2% real annual growth. The IMF has estimated a bit more than 3% a year, but this is much less than the dynamics that the world trade had up to 2008, which was about 7% annually in Britain. And since the end of last year, there was actually a contraction of international trade, which was particularly strong in value terms. So the crisis of, and this of course is because of the expectation that the world recession, and notably the China-US trade war. This is phenomenon of the collapse of world trade this year comes on top of this negative trend that we were observing before the crisis. Now, because of all of this, of the lockdown, Latin America is expected to contract around 5% this year. This is the worst crisis, one of the worst crises in history. Since I write history, I estimated which are worse than 2020, and I only found 2 years, 1914 and 1930. So this is one of the 3 worst crises worst recessions in Latin American history. It may actually be worse, the worst of all, because of the, although the expectation, which we have here by numbers in this slide, for all the major economies and one of the smaller economies, Ecuador, but you see here that well, the expectations here, we have the ECLA, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, of the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank, and they have more or less a similar story with some magnitude. I mean, perhaps the World Bank is the most optimistic, but the IMF and ECLA have a bit more than 5% contraction. The worst being, again, Venezuela. But aside from that, you have huge, strong recessions in Argentina, in Brazil, in Mexico. Ecuador is the small economy that is very hardly hit. And then you have an intermediate story in Peru, Chile, and the best performance is expected for Colombia. But I have my doubts. In the paper that Yayate will circulate that I wrote, the projections in Colombia are between -3 and -7. So it could be as bad as the other economies, okay? Now, and one of the very strong effects that we will have is on social indicators. These are the recent estimates of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which produces the best result on social conditions in Latin America. And what you see here is actually that this is the poverty level. Latin America had reduced poverty significantly between 2002 and 2014, so during the commodity boom. But then it had already started to increase during this last half decade before this crisis. It increased from 28 to 30%, extreme poverty from 8 to 11%. And the medium scenario, I mean, there's a worst case scenario that I'm not including here, is that for poverty to increase to 35%. This means about 30 million people more in poverty in Latin America. Now, the Latin American countries have adopted the typical policies to face the crisis, including lockdowns, but not in every country. I think one of the really bad stories is actually that of Brazil, where although some governors, it's very similar to the US, the central government against lockdowns, but some of the governors in the different states supporting, but in any case, Brazil is becoming one of the worst centers of the epidemics now. The lockdowns do generate a major effect on activity and employment. For example, just a summary case based on my country, Colombia, but the full lockdown, in which we were about 6 weeks, a full lockdown essentially puts 3 out of 5 workers out of work, and only 1 of the 3 can work virtually. So the effect is very, very severe in terms of of employment and income, because since Colombia has about 60% informality, which is more or less the Latin American average, informality and work in a very small enterprises. I mean, the broad definition of informality of the ILO. So not only self-employment and domestic workers, but also workers in very, very small enterprises. So it's about 60%. Many of them have no income, and the poorest in particular have no income. Now, many Latin American countries have developed the conditional cash transfers. So they have used the cash transfers to support the income of the poorest, but there is a significant amount of let's call medium income workers, middle class is how they are called sometimes, but some of them are very vulnerable to falling back into poverty. and there have been new programs for those vulnerable population. So many countries are supporting, let's say, 50% of the households through some form of support, which is very variable from country to country. There is also some employment policies that have been put in place, normally through credits from the state banks and the development banks for firms that keep employment. They essentially finance with cheaper loans. Let's say the firms that keep their workers in place. And in some countries, including Colombia, now there is a small subsidy to employment. In our case, it's 40% of the minimum wage per worker. Now, the magnitude of the effects of the policies is very variable. According to all the estimates, Peru is probably the strongest in terms of policy. Chile is also very strong. And the basic thing, the reason why I'll come back to this in 1 second, is they have fiscal margins because they had a very low public sector debt. But many other countries feel that they don't have the policy space to do very active fiscal policies. I'll come back to this in 1 second. But aside from this fiscal policy, there have been very expansionary monetary policies, more or less everywhere. And a lot of several countries have public sector guarantees. So they use their public sector guarantee fund to guarantee credit to firms. This policy, for example, very, very active in Brazil, in Chile, in Colombia, in Uruguay. For example, in Colombia, the guarantees add up about 8% of GDP. It's not as high as some of the European countries that have been very active in that regard, but it's a significant number to be guaranteeing 8% of GDP in terms of. Now, let me actually go back to the PowerPoint. Exactly to show that the fiscal margin, as you see here, was very different. So you see here, Latin America essentially had a primary surplus in the fiscal accounts of the central government up to 2008. And this is what allowed Latin America to respond to the 2008-2009 crisis with a significant fiscal expansionary policies. You can see here from 2008 to 2010, there was a huge shift in asset. Also, there were some tax cuts. But as a result of that, the margin that was very large for fiscal expenses in 2008 doesn't exist today. Actually, you take into account the interest payments, which are not here in this graph. Latin America actually had an average deficit of about 3% of GDP, and a public sector debt of about 60% of GDP, which compares to a very small deficit in 2008 and a debt which was only about 48%. So many countries are afraid that the crisis will hit them with no fiscal margins, let's say. Let me say that the interpretation of this is, of course, a mixed story. For example, Brazil, which is a country with very high public sector debt, has responded with a very expansionary fiscal package. But other countries are more reluctant, let's say. Peru and Chile have the advantage that they had a very low debt ratio, and they have been able to expand sharply during the crisis. Okay, let me stop here and actually move to the issue of policy, international policies to support Latin America. So let me basically divide them between two groups. monetary policy, so the policy done by the IMF and the international monetary institutions, and then the development banks, the multilateral development banks. Now, on the first, let me say that in the paper I wrote with other colleagues, we talk about 6 types of policies, and let's see, let me first mention them and then go to some of them to see what the effects are on Latin America. So the first one was a major issue of a special drawing rights, of the IMF special drawing rights, which is kind of the only real global money available. So with other people, we proposed, I remember back in March, actually, 500 billion emission of special drawing rights, which is about double the level that was adopted in 2009 to the crisis at the time. It was vetoed by the US with the surprising support of India, which of course was a winner, like all developing countries in the issuance of a special drawing rights. I'll come back to see what the magnitude of that. I think this issue has not died, but it's still it's coming back in the agenda probably. The second is new financial facilities of the IMF, and notably the emergency credit lines for middle-income countries that are called the Rapid Financing Instrument. This has been very useful. This plus the credit line for low-income countries expected to be used by about 100 countries. They have no conditionality, and they are approved very fast, but their magnitude is small. So it's 100% of the quotas. So we'll see in the case of Latin America with numbers what this has implied. The other was the approval of a short-term credit line. This is kind of the response of the IMF to the proposal to have a worldwide swap arrangement. But what was approved was very, very modest. It's about up to 145% of the quota, and which is very small because we'll see the flexible credit line of the IMF, which had the same conditions for approval. This other new credit line is much, much larger. So in my view, I have said that line would be useful. Nobody would use it anyway. We'll see. So basically is the emergency lines, which are small, that the IMF managing director has said that they could give loans for about $100 billion, but up to April, they have only given by 15 billion. Now, 15 billion is very little money. Okay, very little money. I mean, both the IMF managing director and the UNCTAD have talked about $2.5 billion for developing countries. So, so far, this has been very, very small. The third issue is how to finance the IMF. Last year, there was a discussion on the quota reform. It was delayed until 2023. And it was decided that the IMF would be financed with basically the loan facility that countries provide to the IMF through the new arrangements to borrow and through bilateral credit lines. So that was approved in January. And the IMF, in principle, has up to $1 billion in lending capability. But as I said, the demands are very low, except for the emergency facilities. And the emergency facilities, as I pointed out, give very little money in total. But of course, the IMF quota reform, in my view, should be accelerated, as it was approved after the 2009 crisis. Then you have the regulation of capital flows, which should have been used very actively during the period of major flight of capital from emerging economies back in April, in March in particular. It was not used at all. and the credit rating agencies have not been stopped. They have been downgrading countries, so worsening the situation. In Latin America, for example, they downgraded Mexico, and they reduced the outlook for Colombia, and generally and of course they cut further the emergency facilities of the the credit ratings of Argentina and Ecuador. The fifth issue is debt. And let me say that I'll talk a bit more about debt in a few seconds. I think the proposal for a generalized debt standstill which is good for low-income countries. In my view, is not very good for middle-income countries because some countries have actually access to market. So we need an intermediate solution. I'll come back to this. And finally, the regional monetary arrangements. We have one, which is the Latin American Reserve Fund, which has 8 members, which has a little role to play during the crisis. Now, viewed overall, what this implies is that the actions have been very limited at the global level. And in the paper and in an op-ed I wrote that was circulated, my view is that this crisis will be remembered for the very limited international cooperation to manage the crisis. And not only because of that, not only for that, but also for the sharp effect, a sharp contrast, let's say, with the very strong expansionary policies, particularly of the United States for its own management. So the US has been much more aggressive in fiscal and monetary policies than it was in 2008, 2009, but has not cooperated internationally except for a few minor things. So Europe has been more cooperative in terms of international issues, but is immersed in its own internal debates that reduce the capacity of the European Union, let's say, to push for major reforms. So the contrast between the decisions that were taken in the April 2009 meeting of the Group of 20, and the decisions that were taken in the meeting of heads of state of the Group of 20 in late March, and then of the finance ministers in mid-April, look, like nothing compared to what was decided in 2009. So the cooperation has been really, really meaningful. Let me actually show you some numbers of what this will imply. So, for example, this is my estimate of what will Latin America receive with the initial 500 billion of SDRs. Basically, I estimate 0.7% on average for Latin America at the bottom. Most countries are around that number, 0.6 to 0.8. There are a few countries that receive a proportionally much more, basically because these are countries where the economic activity in dollar terms has collapsed. So you see Venezuela, for example, will be receiving equivalent to 0.5% of GDP. Nicaragua, which is another country hardly hit for economic activity in recent years, receive more than 2%. But most countries will receive around 0.7. Now, this is not a low number. Let me say that in terms of foreign exchange reserves, it's an increase of about 5%, but it's also equivalent to about 40% of the net capital flows into Latin America last year. So it's not a significant number. And of course, you can think of more emissions. There are people calling for $1 trillion or more. I mean, the basic problem with the big numbers is that they will require an approval by the US Congress, which means several years to approve. So this is why we kept our proposal in 500 billion. It can go up to about 650 billion without having to go to the US Congress. Now, in terms of excuse me, in terms of the emergency facilities, 7 countries have already been approved these emergency facilities, but you can see here that the total for them is $3.3 billion. This is very little money, period. As the 15th that has been given to all developing countries by the end of April is also very little money. Anyway, so but it serves. It's very useful because it's they are approved very fast and they have no conditionality. Latin America has access to other credit lines. This is before the crisis, although the case of Colombia, the flexible credit line. The flexible credit line is a kind of guarantee line that is very useful, but it's limited to countries with the terminology of the IMF has to have a strong fundamentals. So Colombia and Mexico have had it for about 10 years. And Peru and Chile have recently said that they would apply for it. This is money that is not supposed to be disbursed, as you can see on the right-hand side. But it's, of course, a kind of you know, an overdraft facility, let's call it, which is quite useful and gives a backing for countries with private capital markets. The other standby arrangements and other facilities have been given to Argentina, Honduras, and Ecuador. The Ecuador has actually run into problems because of conditionality. And so this facility that they had for $4 billion was actually suspended effectively on May 1st. Actually, Ecuador was given on that same day a small loan of 643, but the big loan was suspended. They are going to renegotiate a new one. Honduras has, of course, a small country, has a facility, but most of the money actually has gone to Argentina, which has one of the largest loans in the IMF history. The Argentinian government has said that they don't want to use that money more, but they have having the support of the IMF for the debt restructuring process. Now, in terms of private capital markets and the cost of financing those private capital markets, let me point out something that is interesting. I mean, there was, of course, a big flight of capital from emerging economies in late February through March. It was $100 billion. But there are signs that has stopped in April. And in the case of Latin America, actually 7 countries have had access to bond financing. They include Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, but also smaller countries, Guatemala, Paraguay. I'm missing one in my mind anyway. But there are 7 countries that have been using bond financing since mid-April. And as you can see here, actually, you can see the spreads in blue. They remain very high, but when you take into account the base comparison, which is the U.S. Treasury bonds, which have fallen significantly in terms of yields, actually the yields of the emerging markets have been around 6%, which is actually better than what was typical during this disturbance of 2018, 2019, much lower than during the global financial crisis, and much lower than after the East Asian crisis. So the financing costs are not extraordinarily good, but they are not, more or less fine. Depends critical on the country. And for this reason, in my view, I am against the view that there should be a generalized debt standstill for emerging economies. I think there are 3 cases that they have to be analyzed separately. The countries that need deep debt restructuring, which in Latin America are Argentina and Ecuador. The countries that have access to the market, the 7 countries I mentioned, and an intermediate case in which I have supported a kind of voluntary mechanism by which countries managed by multilateral development banks, by which countries can go into a debt standstill that will be internationally supervised by those, by the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank in the case of Latin America. And finally, in this regard, the FLAR, the Latin American Reserve Fund, these are the 8 members. As you can see, they can provide up to a maximum of $6.5 billion. It's not much money, but it will certainly support the country. This fund, by the way, has worked very well through history, and I expect it to play an active role during this crisis. The other mechanism of financing is multilateral development banks. Now, this is the story of the role of multilateral development banks with Latin America, which is an interesting story. You can see here the World Bank in the bottom. The World Bank was the major source of financing back in 1990, the 1970s and 1980s, let's say. But essentially has not increased its long-term, its long-term trend in terms of financing has been stagnant since 1990. But the World Bank is important during crisis. This is 98, 99, but particularly 2009, 2010. So they are a counter-cyclical instrument for Latin America more than a regular instrument. Now, in terms of regular financing, you see the expansion of the Inter-American Development Bank through time, but particularly of the two, let's say, sub-regional banks, the old Andean Development Corporation in gray, which has been actually the most dynamic. It has expanded its membership, so it's actually a regional development bank today. And you can see here competes with the Inter-American Development Bank in terms of financing. And then you have this little yellow on top. This is the Central American Bank for Economic Integration. It's a small bank, but it's very important for Central American countries, the small countries of the region. Anyway, the two of them have been the most dynamic, particularly after 2008. And you can see here also in terms of the equity of these institutions. You can see here that CAF, well, for all the World Bank, the Inter-American, the World Bank, the core World Bank, which is the Bank for Reconstruction and Development, has had essentially no growth in equity since 2007. This is, I'm comparing with before the previous crisis. The Inter-American has had a 66% growth, but look at the 200% for CAF, and the Central American Bank for Economic Integration is double, but it was actually capitalized again in December of last year. And if you include the capitalization of the bank, is now growing more in capital than CAF. So in general, Latin America depends heavily on its own institutions and on the Inter-American Development Bank, in which it has a majority vote. And the president is always a Latin American citizen. So the real question, all of these banks, by the way, have been responded positively, but there are two major problems. One problem is the World Bank. The World Bank has been increasing its lending to Latin America in a counter-cyclical way, but it's lending much less than it was lending in 2009, 2010. So its role is weakened this time. The Inter-American Development Bank and CAF, which are the two major sources of financing of a multilateral character, have one basic problem. They have no enough capital to multiply their lending as they did in 2009, 2010. Let us remember that one of the big decisions of the G20 was to capitalize all development banks in 2009, most were capitalized in 2009 and the World Bank in 2010. This time, there is no decision to capitalize the multilateral development banks, so the capacity to lend is actually more limited. The only one that has capitalized is the Central American Bank, but that's the smallest. My estimate is that with the new capital, they can increase their lending by 45%. But this is we need to increase that in a similar way, the lending by the Inter-American and the CAF. That's how much they grew in 2009, 2010. They grew by 70%. Now they are not. So although the reactions in terms of creating new facilities, in allowing all loans to be used for, approved loans to be used for new purposes, in terms of speeding up the lending process, etc. All of this has happened in all of the 4 banks. So far the capacity, the expected capacity to provide lending to Latin America is actually quite limited. In simple ways, Latin America does face a major problem in terms of financing and multilateral cooperation so far is extremely weak. I end up with this. I took more time, Yayati, but thank you very much again for the invitation to be with you and all these people today.
Oh, wow, Jose Antonio, that's very interesting. And there are lots of questions, but I have a set of questions also. I just wanted to check with you on the last point you made about the capitalization that occurred in 2009. Your table doesn't suggest that. Your table for the capital of IBRD and the Inter-American Development Bank doesn't show much increase in equity in 2009.
Well, because it was, this actually, I don't have the authorized capital. I should have the, but so the authorized capital was gradually made. It was more gradual in the case of the Inter-American Bank when it was also smaller. They had a 70%, more or less a 70% increase in the authorized capital. That was gradually. But you see that gradually they got to 66% growth in equity. In the case of CAF, by the way, the new name of CAF is called the Development Bank of Latin America, because it's really a Latin American bank now. But they kept the old acronym, which is the Andean Development Corporation, because it was originally an Andean bank. But it has membership for most countries of the region, including Brazil and Mexico. And
I hadn't realized that is so important now. That's quite fascinating. That CAF is so important now. CAF has become so important,
Very important. No, CAF is really an important bank. Very important. I mean, as you see in the graph, is comparable to the Inter-American in the last 5 years. So that CAF tripled its capital in 2009. Triple. Again, it was gradually in these effects, but it was triple, and it increased later on a bit more. But now they are in both cases they have a capital constraint to increase lending, and of course you know that this is also an issue of the credit rating. So in order to have good access to international markets, they cannot go over certain leverage because otherwise their rating will be down.
So, there are many, many questions. So I'm going to try and summarize some of them or put them into groups. And I'll begin with the ones that are specifically on the pandemic. So there are some which are asking about the differences in response to pandemic and in containing COVID-19 in the different Latin American countries. So, for example, there is a question saying the countries and states where successes were achieved in curbing the virus were places with sound public health infrastructure. And so what is the state of public health systems in Latin America? Second related question is that aside from the differences in political leadership, what are the reasons behind the success of Argentina in the COVID-19 process vis-a-vis Brazil? And can you highlight the nature of social protection measures in this?
Okay. Let's say let's put it this way, the decisions to do lockdowns or not do them have no political leaning. I mean, the worst cases are actually Brazil and Mexico. We have totally opposite political regimes. The, let's say the Brazilian is almost a semi-fascist regime,
Yeah.
and Mexico is a progressive president. So it's, but both of them have denied the urgency of taking action. Mexico has been taking some action, and some Brazilian states have been taking action. But in that regard, Argentina is together with Chile, Peru, and Colombia, for example, which have taken, actually, to some extent also Venezuela, which have been taking action for lockdowns.
Yeah.
Well, in Colombia, it has been a long one, as well as in Argentina. In Chile, in Peru also. Peru has also been very tough in terms of the lockdown. Chile has just adopted a full lockdown for Santiago. They were doing by neighborhoods. Now 2 days ago, they had a full lockdown now. So countries have been moving in that direction, but some political regimes, for different reasons, don't like it. Okay.
So
Now,
there's a question about Cuba also. So if you could add
about what?
Cuba.
You know, I don't know quite know. Cuba has also, yeah, has also has some lockdown. Cuba has a very good health regime, a health system. Actually, has been able to respond very well with the health system. Anyway, now the effects of the lockdown are very strong on economic activity. As I said, you eliminate, and even more in social terms, because some of the people who get locked down have no income.
Yeah.
And there are some middle class people who are using their savings, and they may run into difficulties if the lockdown get too long. So the effects on employment are going to be very tough, and the effects on poverty, as we saw, also very tough. Now, what have countries done? I would say basically all of them have used the conditional cash transfer they had developed before, giving an extra money, a little extra money, accelerating the payments. Now the problem with with the conditional cash transfers is that they only reach, I would say, basically something like 20 to 30% of the households. So there is a group of intermediate households, which are, since poverty has been falling, they have been what was called the rise of the middle class. But the rise of the middle class in Latin America was the rise of the vulnerable middle class, let's call it. Actually, the World Bank uses that terminology, vulnerable. So the vulnerable is the group that has increased the most. And that's why many of the vulnerable population is falling back into poverty. Now, for that population, you have to develop new mechanisms because they were not in place. And some countries have done that. The most aggressive has been Peru. Peru has been very, very good in trying to support households. They are giving a $200 per household for 70% of the households. So it's a massive program. I mean, just as a comparison, Chile is also doing the same. Brazil is actually doing, it's a very interesting issue, Brazil versus Mexico. Because Brazil has a right-wing regime, but it has increased because of parliamentary pressure, the support for the poor households. So they have increased significantly the amount of support for households. Mexico has this very left-wing government with a president that doesn't believe in fiscal deficits. So he's very reluctant to increase the social programs.
Oh no, really? Oh.
Yeah, it's a very, he has also been changing them, and there's a lot of criticism that the new programs are not working as well. They said the old social programs, including the conditional cash transfers, and other programs, for example, the subsidized health system, etc., were neoliberal and they have to be reformed, but he hasn't had time to put in place alternative programs that are better. And so Mexico actually is a very funny case. So when you see Brazil, which has a higher public sector debt and a right-wing government, is spending much more than Mexico, which has a lower debt and a left-wing government. It's a very, very funny,
That
very
is
funny
actually
system.
fascinating. In
Yeah.
fact,
In any case, the employment subsidies are done by a few countries. Colombia and Chile are doing employment subsidies.
but not any direct transfers.
No, also.
Also,
It's
I
on
see.
top of.
Okay.
It's on top of. It's on top of the direct transfers. Yeah.
So this actually links to a question on how will the disparities and inequalities between regions and cities within Latin America be affected by the COVID crisis?
That's a very interesting question. Let's put it this way. In the urban areas,
Yeah.
the worst hit are the poor. The worst hit are the poor because they have a high share of informal workers, they are left with no income. The job, people have just lost jobs. The proportion coming from small firms is much higher than from large firms. So large firms have tried to keep their employment. Okay, and so the urban households, excuse me, and on top of that, they have other problems. For example, let's say you close the schools, and you decide that that education is going to be virtual. Fantastic idea, except that the poor don't have computers. so the inequalities in the education have got much worse because of this. So the government has been providing computers, but it's a poor substitute, and there are alternatives that mean household meals, meals for school children, which is very important for the Latin American poor. The bill that is given to children at school. Anyway, it's not working anymore because of the closing of the schools. Some countries have tried to replace it with money or giving food to those households. But it's a very poor substitute. So the poor are in the urban areas are very hardly hit. Okay, and there is no question that in the urban area there is going to be a deterioration in income distribution. Now, at the same time, the rural workers are working and have their incomes. Okay, so and those are the poorest in Latin America. So very interestingly, the urban poor are very hardly hit. The rural poor are not. I mean, there's a lot of question whether the sales of foodstuffs are working as well as they were before the crisis. But generally speaking, countries are trying to keep their, let's say, the value chains in food working well. And those food value chains have actually been working the best. Those and say the health are the two value chains that are working more or less well.
Okay, that's an interesting angle, different from some other countries.
Yeah.
So you had talked about fiscal space, and in a sense, you were suggesting that the fiscal space is ultimately because of external constraints, because of fear of capital flight and so on. But you were also, I mean, I suppose the question here is about whether there can be fiscal space through other means of raising revenues. I mean, I know you and I agree about raising corporate taxation for multinationals and so on. But here is a question which is a little intriguing. Why not introduce land value tax as suggested by Henry George? Land value tax can help remove all other taxes like income tax, goods and services tax, corporate tax, VAT, etc. This is a slightly off-angle question, but...
But let me answer that in terms of what my positions on those issues have been on Colombia. Okay.
Yeah.
My view has been that there should be no tax reform this year in the midst of the crisis.
Yeah, right.
Okay. But there were some tax benefits for corporations that have been approved last year in the tax reform, I have been saying was delay those benefits. Okay. But next year, because our public sector debt to GDP will be increasing something between, something between 52 or 53% to 60%. I mean, that's a very likely scenario because of the additional spending, but also the falling tax revenues this year. My view is that we have to prepare for a major tax reform next year, which has to be very progressive. It has to include a wealth tax as well as a land tax, okay? A higher taxes.
So you are also
yeah. So that's my view.
Right.
Okay.
So there are a number of questions about, okay, this is a global question and it relates to the whole multilateral institutions and so on. Many international organizations, OECD, ILO, UNCTAD, are suggesting an ambition similar to the Marshall Plan, but at the global level. So what should be the multilateral approach? And adding to that, is there a possibility for a regional approach if there isn't a global approach?
You mean to, excuse me, I didn't get the question.
Basically, the idea of a Marshall Plan kind of.
Oh, I see. No, well, I think for low-income countries, yes, there should be a Marshall Plan. I mean, again, no developed countries is speaking about this. I mean, this is part of my basic issue that the G20 has been so damn weak during this crisis compared to how it was in 2009. I mean, 2009 is very interesting because, of course, you have a Labour government, Gordon Brown in Britain, and you had which actually Gordon Brown, we should remember, was the head of the International Monetary and Financial Committee also at the time.
Okay.
So the head of the IMF board, let's say, was him. But also we have the US administration was actually supportive, both under Bush, but particularly under Obama, which had started to, in early 2009, he became president. The US was very supportive, and of course the other European countries were very supportive. Japan was very supportive. But this time we have some support from European countries. Let's say France and Germany have been supportive, but the US support has been totally lacking, or almost totally lacking. And the Europeans are not as courageous, let's say, in terms of the support.
Yeah.
Now, since the Europeans are the major source of ODA, it's a big question whether they will give a significant amount of additional spending in the midst of their own domestic crisis. Anyway, it's a big question mark. By the way, China is also very important.
Yeah.
Because China is through the Belt and Road and other initiatives, is a big lender of low-income countries and some low-middle-income countries. And it's unclear what is the position of China. I mean, for example, let's say on debt. On debt, the Paris Club already said that it will give a debt standstill for low-income countries, which benefits 77 countries, I think. Only for this year, I think it should also be for next year, I said. But China has not announced anything explicit. So we'll manage the issue bilaterally. So which, anyway,
which is interesting.
It's not the same.
Yeah.
It's not the same.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the Marshall Plan. But for me, an aggressive response will have to come through, more credit lines of the IMF that are unconditional, or have a conditionality that will allow for a significant increase in fiscal support during the crisis. Okay, That second part is still missing. The first part, the emergency credit lines, I said, they have already been approved, but the money they have been approving is too little for what the developing countries need. Now, for emerging economies, the other solution is, as I said, is give them more multilateral development bank lending. I mean, it's to expand the multilateral development banks in a significant way, as that was the policy in 2009, 2010. So I think that's what is really missing now. More than a Marshall Plan, let's say, more than transfer, let's say, because I remember the Marshall Plan were transfers. I'm not asking for transfer for middle income countries. I'm asking for financing for them. And perhaps for mechanisms that will allow for debt standstills and debt restructuring for countries that need that.
So there is a question about quantitative easing in Latin America, that this is a very sharp reversal of policy in Latin America. And so do you think in places where the central banks are themselves politicized, like Brazil, this may create problems in future?
Well, let me put it this way. The most important issue in the discussion, so there are two issues. How much government bonds the central banks buy. Okay. Yeah. That's one issue, and how they do. But that's one policy which is generally accepted and is being done in an aggressive way by countries that can do it. I mean, the countries that cannot do it are the economies that are dollarized, because essentially they have no central bank. Okay, and there are three countries in Latin America which are dollarized. Ecuador being the worst case.
Ecuador being, and which are the other two?
Panama, which has always been dollarized since it became independent, and El Salvador, which also became dollarized in the 1990s. Anyway, so those three countries have no monetary policy, let's say, but the other countries have not. Again, and that's independent of political regimes. They say the Brazilian central bank has also been very aggressive in buying government bonds. Okay. Now, the other thing, which is buying private sector assets of different characters, that's a more complicated story. But central banks have been moving in that direction on a smaller scale, not on an aggressive way, but have been moving in that direction. For example, the Colombian central bank, for the first time in history, is buying private sector bonds. Okay. Okay. So remember that one big difference between a developing country and a developed country is that we don't issue international currencies. So you buy massively bonds, and in the case of the Federal Reserve, and issue dollars, those dollars will have demand. If we issue pesos, I'm not sure.
But you know, here in India, we're desperate to get our government to borrow from the central bank. They're just not spending at all. So we would like them to do that, what you're saying.
Okay. Yeah.
So now, Jose Antonio, there is a whole bunch of questions about what is going to happen, and at many different levels. So let me just give you an idea. Do you expect a significant repositioning of the global trade order in the wake of the crisis? How do you place India and China in this order? So that's about what do you think will happen to global trade. But then there is another about what do you think will happen to the politics of Latin America? Is the pandemic going to change the political landscape in any way, or in the configurations? Then there is another even bigger question. Will capitalism survive this pandemic? I mean, what is going to be the global, this is one of the questions. And finally, to bring it back from capitalism, what's going to happen to soccer, to football?
That may be more important than the question of the capitalism, because there's no question that capitalism will survive.
But you think football may
Soccer.
not? Yeah.
Soccer or football, as we call it.
Yeah.
We call it football.
Football. In fact, I was wondering why they said soccer, but football. What is going to happen to football?
Yeah, football is the original name because the football is British, right? No, well, it's a big question. But as you have seen in Europe, they are taking steps to allow for games again. Sometimes without the public and sometimes with public. But I think it will be like all economic activities gradually, will be liberalized, but very gradually, more gradually than other activities. For example, let's put it this way, in the positions and the discussions, manufacturing and wholesale trade will be liberalized first, okay? The retail trade and retail services, like you see, my hair is very long now. So I need that service to be provided to me, but it's not. I mean, those will take more time, and as well as restaurants. Restaurants are everywhere doing home service, but there is no. And then all the sports and cultural activities. Cultural activities, of course, are moving online, but when they're going to be, in theaters. The same problem. Those activities may be the last, actually, and the sports will be the last. So I think the sports will be liberalized, but for videos. I mean, for people they to play, and then through television people watch it. Anyway, now what is going to happen to international institutions? Well, let me put it this way. By the way, I appreciate very, very much the work of the IMF managing director.
Yeah.
She has been very good. Probably among the international institutions, by far the best in terms of pushing for action. Not very successful, but and the IMF more or less has been doing a better job. Okay. Now, I actually, very funny, this is, we had yesterday actually, one of these web seminars and with Latin Americans, and Joe Stiglitz was speaking. I saw him speaking in favor of the IMF. Oh my God, I said, what is going on? So the IMF has been, I think, playing a much more positive role this time.
Even the way Argentina's debt restructuring, yes?
Oh, very good in supporting Argentina debt restructuring. They will support Ecuador's debt restructuring. So they have been playing a positive role generally. Okay, within the discussions, for example, there's the other problem, the veto of the U.S. on this special problem rights. So it's more the membership than the staff. The World Bank, in my view, the World Bank president has been very poor. Even talking again about structural reforms, which is a no-no for most developing countries today. But they are expanding. The program that they approved for $160 billion for 15 months is actually more aggressive than in 2009, 2010. And very importantly, has a higher share of lending to low-income countries. One of the big problems with the 2009-2010 financing is that the share of low-income countries actually fell during the crisis. Anyway, so the World Bank has been doing, I don't like the World Bank president, but the World Bank has been doing its job. Now, the big push for capitalization of the banks is nowhere. I haven't seen a single statement on that, which was one of the major statements of the April 2009 London meeting of the G20. Remember the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank, they have a tripling of their capital approved in 2009. I said the Inter-American had a 70% increase, etc. But the big push for that is nowhere. Um, so it's, now in trade is a good question because I mean there is no question for me that the international trade is going to be much less dynamic, and particularly the value chains, which were the major engine of the rapid growth of trade between the mid 1980s and 2007. Big growth of 7% per year in real terms of international trade. That I think is going to be in deep trouble. So now that is a shock for Asian, particularly East Asian economies. For Latin America, it's not because the major value chains are Mexico, US. And I think they will continue. I mean, proximity is going to be a major topic for value chains. So distant value chains are going to be affected. Proximity is going to play a better role, which means less international trade. So this fast recovery that we saw after the 2008, 2009 crisis is something that we are not going to see. So actually, even in my graph on before the crisis, in terms of value, the value of international trade in late 2019
Already coming.
was almost the same as it was in 2007. So that the international trade is not going to be an engine of growth for anyone going forward, which of course is a big issue in our terms. Now, in institutional terms, it's a big question, but the World Trade Organization has two problems. First of all, it has a change of leadership. They have to elect a new director, and there's a big question mark of whom or who wants to be in the current circumstances. But but it's also a big question mark about the institutional character. But that was the discussion last year. I mean, when the dispute settlement mechanism collapsed because of the U.S. Opposition, and it's unclear what measures are being taken to generate a more dynamic international trade order. I mean, there is actually, by the way, this Asian agreement on intra-regional trade, right? India is not a member, but all the East Asian countries are, as well as Australia, New Zealand. So maybe regional trade agreements for Latin America, for example. One good policy I'm recommending is to push for more intra-regional trade.
Regional trade. In Africa too, I think that is happening.
Africa is doing the same, yes. Yeah.
Wow, that was so interesting, Jose Antonio. I'm sorry for keeping you so long, but then these answers were so fascinating, and the discussion has been so interesting that we didn't want to let you go. But this has been a very, very enriching discussion. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Ayate, for the invitation. It has been a pleasure to be with you.
No, and I know
all the people who have seen the.
Yeah, that's right. And the ones who for whom it'll be too early, they can come and watch it later on and watch the video later on. So that's good. So just thank you all for joining us. Today we're ending this series of daily lectures, but we're going to keep organizing lectures as long as the lockdowns continue, because that's currently the only way to have any exchange or discussion is through these online conversations. In a way, it's an interesting blessing that we can actually get people like Jose Antonio Ocampo and others to actually come and interact with us. So that's also an unexpected advantage of what is otherwise not a very good situation globally. But I would also just let everybody who's watching know that the next lecture will be on Wednesday, the 20th of May, by Martin Abeles of CEPAL, Argentina, who is going to be talking about the Argentine situation in the COVID-19 crisis. So
very good.
Yeah, that's right. That is going to happen at 6:30 p.m. but in India time. But please do keep visiting the website and subscribe to the mailing list so you get information about the upcoming events. Once again, I want to thank Jose Antonio for a really very, very interesting and very rich and so informative discussion and very thoughtful responses to all the questions. Thank you so much, Jose Antonio.
No, my pleasure, my pleasure. Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Good. So we shall be in touch. Yeah.